In today's video, we're transferring Pierre Gasly from AlphaTauri to Alpine, just as has been confirmed in real life this weekend at the Japanese Grand Prix. The Frenchman is moving across to Alpine Racing to replace the outgoing Fernando Alonso and partnering his all-time friend Esteban Ocon to create an all-French alliance at the French outfit. So in F1 22 career mode, the only way this transfer is possible is after round 1 in season 1. So we're going to begin Gasly's career in Alpine at the second round at Jeddah for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And of course, this is on this year's current F1 game, so Alpine are starting off a little bit lower than McLaren, and it's up to the game to see naturally how they upgrade their cars. So take the results with a massive pinch of salt. It's more to see how Pierre as an individual does versus his team Esteban Ocon, and then generally speaking, can he help the team in whatever kind of fight they're going to end up in by the end of this season in the game. So straight off the bat, first qualifying ever for his brand new team. Gasly did get out qualified by Ocon making it into Q3 in P9, Gasly P12, but crucially both McLarens, their main rivals this season, ahead of both. So both of them have positions to gain in this race. Let's now see what Gasly can do on this first lap. As now 5 lights are out and we're underway. It's a really good getaway for Gasly on the medium tyre versus the Alfa Romeos on the hards. He makes a triple overtake on both Alfa Romeos and Ocon, and then there's 3 wide with the 2 McLarens. Gasly, with renewed confidence maybe in himself and this new environment, is able to make an overtake, finish one on the McLaren, and get the second one done eventually through the left-hander. And by the time before they've even got to the end of sector 1, he is up to P7 from P12 on the grid. So you gotta say the first ever lap in this new job of his has gone pretty well, you know, very, very well. And now he can try and settle down and try and stay ahead of the McLarens. Ocon directly behind them in P10. So Ocon lost a position, Gasly gained 5. And that's a position he would go on to hold, finishing ahead of both McLarens. Ocon was able to get up one more position to P9, and somewhere in that race, Lando Norris fell away to P12. So already Gasly making a positive impact. The Alpines outscoring McLaren, and it's a really good first race because that's best of the rest. You can't ask for much more behind the Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferraris. Moving on then though to the next round, the Australian Grand Prix, and Ocon has come back at Gasly and manages to beat him in this one. P6 for Ocon, Gasly P7, Ricciardo again, the only McLaren featuring the points, with Lando Norris having a DNF in this one, along with Leclerc, which explains Ocon having the P6 rather than best of the rest P7. And then we move on into the Imola GP. So we've had the sprint round. Gasly managed to get P8 in the sprint race, Ocon P9. 5 red lights, and they're underway for the full fat proper Grand Prix on Sunday, and Ocon continues his momentum off the Australian Grand Prix. Of course, Jeddah, you know, Gasly maybe surprising him a little bit by, you know, doing better than him. So coming back, you know, he has been at the team for a couple of more years than Pierre, so maybe want to establish himself as the team leader. No, this is his team, so he goes on, takes that confidence from Australia into Jeddah, makes some great overtakes on a Red Bull included, and gets up to P6. Gasly down to P10 at this stage, but we simulate the rest of the race. 63 laps later, Gasly does manage to actually eventually get Ocon back at some point in that race. It was a 2-stopper, so maybe strategy calls, I don't know, but he's got ahead and he's in P8 now with Ocon P9, Lando climbing up to P7, Ricciardo P10. So far, quite equally matched, you would say, and doing a good job for the team versus their nearest rival, McLaren, in the Constructors' Championship. Both teams at this stage of the season now upgrading at the same sort of rate, as you can see by the R&D chart, as we head into the Miami Grand Prix. And this Grand Prix in real life wasn't exactly happy hunting grounds for Gasly, and it shows here in the game. P10 versus Ocon's P8 with a Haas in the middle of them. But you can see McLaren had a really really, really strong race. P5 and 6 must have been a bit of a hectic one because Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen not even featuring in the top half of this finishing race result order. So whether they had contact or a crash, I don't know. But McLaren now with that get lucked into some really solid position. But as we enter into the proper long European portion of the season, Gasly comes through for a top 10 finish in qualifying. P9 in the grid. Ocon down in P13 behind Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. So that's going to be a bit awkward for Alpine to see. And also for Fernando Alonso, I'm sure he'll be very smug with that. We go 5 red lights and we're underway, riding on board with Gasly just to preview what the beginning of his race is. Bit of a slow getaway. He started on the hards, which was very interesting. You got a couple of people around him on softs, i.e. Fernando Alonso there, and the Alfa Romeo split on strategy with the medium compound and the soft tyre use. Gasly struggling with those hard tyres. Ocon on the soft, so very peculiar strategy that Alpine put him on at the start of this race, but he's still ahead of Ocon at this stage in P12. Ocon actually in a 3-wide battle, you may see behind, with Lance Stroll and Mick Schumacher, but I think because he's on the inside for the next left-hander, he's going to just about edge them and stay ahead for P14. At this stage, you'd say Gasly settling down to go long in this race, and going long paid off for him. It was a tough day for Alpine at this race. Fernando Alonso awkwardly finishes ahead of both Alpines in P8, but Gasly crucially gets points versus Ocon's no points show. At this point this season, both drivers individually are very equally matched. Both have 20 points, so the partnership's working well. They're pushing each other clearly with the kind of, well, I would say a healthy rivalry, but we know maybe in the past it hasn't been so healthy, so that's going to be one interesting thing in real life to see if Gasly and Ocon can actually remain quite respectful of one another, because we know they do have a bit of a history of maybe not being the best of pals. But really more so for the season versus McLaren, it's more of a case of their car is not quick enough at this stage of the season. McLaren have the edge over them in the constructors. And as we go on towards the Monaco Grand Prix, the McLaren sort of subtle bias that I feel has always been there a little bit in the game comes through, because they have a massive upgrade that takes them quite close to Mercedes now on the R&D chart, and the Monaco Grand Prix result is just an absolute fever dream. Lando Norris goes on to win the Monaco Grand Prix for McLaren. Ricciardo P7, both McLarens ahead of the Alpines. Gasly got the better of Ocon in P8. Ocon, though, you look at the grid slot, he started P16, so he had an amazing recovery actually to get back up that high on the grid. So fair play, kudos to him. But I don't know what kind of wacky race this was with Lando winning from P5 on the grid. There must have been some sort of issue and shunt for the guys in the top teams. And now I'm thinking, if this was real life and you're Alpine, you would really want to make a bit of a statement and come back strong at Baku. And they do. They bring similar sort of upgrades to bring them back quite close to McLaren. But you can also see other teams behind Haas, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, even Aston Martin are actually keeping up the rate of upgrade. So this is already maybe kind of skewing away from what we're seeing in real life, and this is more what the game is chucking up by simulating the whole season, because you've got a lot of the midfield coming up and it being quite competitive, which is going to mean that each individual driver performance means that much more now. So Gasly needs to make a difference that Alpine are hoping by signing it. So because I feel this would be quite an important race for Alpine to come back a little bit and have a bit of a statement, we're going to preview the start of this race with the Alpine boys. Gasly does well to get into the top 10 again in P8. Fernando Alonso once again dragging the Aston Martin up into Q3 in P9. Ocon P11. Lando Norris, last race's race winner with a grid penalty, down in P18. So this is a massive chance for the Alpine boys to try and get some points back on them time, it's an okay start for Gasly, but then he gets swamped a little bit with just just nowhere to go into turn 1, seeing 3 wide ahead of him, and Ricciardo overtaking the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez, but then Perez gets caught up a little bit with Ricciardo through that next turn. Bit slow. Sainz has a run. Gasly's been able to maintain his P8, and then he's going to go for a huge dive bomb, get the Ferrari, just managed to slot in behind the Red Bull of Pierre Gasly. So at this stage, he's up into P7, Ocon P11, but unfortunately for Gasly, by the end of that race, Ocon will be the one who finishes ahead in P7, Pierre in P8, both McLarens getting ahead, Lando with an insane recovery from where he was on the grid up into P5. The overwhelming pace is with McLaren. So in this, experiment season of this video, McLaren are pulling away a little bit. Now, potentially, this is more about micro zooming in on the inter-team battle between the two Frenchmen of Ocon and Gasly. In the next race, unfortunately, Ocon has a DNF, and Gasly manages to pick up just 2 measly points for Alpine. That kind of region of where Alpine seem to be operating so far in this season will remain true at the British Grand Prix. Gasly finishing in P7, Ocon P8, but again, they're just so equally matched. They're pretty much, unless one of them has an issue, they're literally together so far this entire season, and more so we're seeing versus their rivals McLaren, who are pulling away a little bit in terms of performance, with Lando picking up a home GP podium behind Hamilton and Leclerc. The Austrian Grand Prix at the Red Bull Ring ends up being a very difficult race for the French team. Ocon with another DNF, and Gasly no points, finishing behind the likes of Valtteri Bottas, Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin, and Ricciardo P8 in the McLaren. I'm assuming Lando was also in the top half, comfortably in the points. And you can kind of see why that is if we now look back at the R&D chart heading into their home race, the French Grand Prix. McLaren are pretty much going toe-to-toe with Mercedes now on the R&D chart, whereas Alpine are just about staying ahead of the cars behind them of Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, Haas, Aston Martin. Now, seeing as the French Grand Prix is the home race for not only the team but both the drivers, I thought it would be rude not to preview the beginning of this race. Starts off in intermediate conditions. Gasly and Ocon both made it through into Q3 just about, in P9 and P10. Pierre with an actually really good start to get Lewis Hamilton into turn 1, slots in behind the 2 McLarens of Norris and Ricciardo. Ocon, unfortunately, falls away and is actually battling Fernando Alonso at this stage. Hamilton then comes back at Gasly, and Gasly falls back down to P9. Alonso at this stage is fighting Schumacher, it looks like, but both of them are now battling Ocon and staying ahead of him, I think, quite awkwardly into the second sector. So Gasly staying ahead and being the lead car in this home race at the beginning, at least on lap 1. Ocon P11 does manage to get Fernando Alonso back, but the race is going to end up being a disaster for Gasly in his home race. It's a DNF, an engine failure. That's 3 engine failures for the team as a whole in the last 4 races. Ocon does manage to just about scramble some points in P9. Fernando Alonso fell away in the Aston Martin, but not exactly happy hunting grounds then for Gasly in that one. We then set our sights onto the last portion of the European part of the season, and there is a clear divide between the performance of McLaren and Alpine, and very much so now. Alpine actually now have to look backwards rather than forwards, and they need to be worried by Haas and Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri and Aston Martin, because they're so close together now that the drivers are making the difference, and I think that's why we're seeing Fernando Alonso's AI making a huge difference for the green outfit. And really also, to be fair, the Alpine boys are doing such a good job at just keeping ahead of all those cars and still scoring those consistent points in the region of around P7 to P10. And that pattern is going to hold true for the next 2 Grand Prix until we get to Zandvoort, where Ocon just has a bit of a howler. I don't know what went on. Maybe he had a crash or whatever, but he finished a lap down in P15 with Gasly getting P9. So that would be a massive race for Gasly versus his teammate to be able to get points, whereas, Ocon was floundering with being lapped by most of the grid. And in this final race in the European portion of the season, it is a similar outlook in terms of the R&D chart, if not even tighter, with Alfa Romeo and Haas literally being on top of Alpine on the R&D chart. But this pairing of Gasly and Ocon is showing to be a very strong partnership, because despite how tight that midfield fight is for those lower end of the points, the two Alpine boys are so unbelievably consistent. For the next 6 races all the way to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, they are finishing in that region of P7 to P10. But at Suzuka, very much like in real life, Gasly can't seem to get any luck around the Japanese Grand Prix, and he has an engine failure, which sees Ocon being the only lone Alpine. But yeah, all the way through the rest of it until the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, they remain very, very consistent and do a great job of just keeping that kind of position, even though they've got such strong competition from the teams behind them. And it means going into the final race of this season, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, you can see there is a clear gulf between McLaren and Alpine. That's a bit more due to the game, of course. If this was real life, you know, basing off what we're seeing, Alpine are actually the better team this season of, you know, bringing those last bit of upgrades in the second half of this season. But you can also see very clearly from this, if you look closer at the Constructors' Championship, because of how strong Gasly and Ocon are as two individual drivers together in a team, they have got such a decent points haul versus Haas, Aston Martin, Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, and I truly believe that's down to that pairing being so strong, and what I believe is going to be such a strong pairing in real life next year in 2023. And so now we come to the final race of this first ever season of Gasly in the Alpine, and we'll look at how his entire race does over this 5-lapper around Abu Dhabi. It's only 5 laps because at this point, unlike the video I did with Ricciardo back to Red Bull, there was less intrigue about, you know, where he finishes. This is more just about seeing how he does, you know, on track basically versus the car around him. Nothing's really at stake. Alpine are going to hold that position that they have in the standings. It's a pretty okay getaway for Gasly. He's going to try and make a move on the Alfa Romeo in this next section, try and get up into P8. Ocon at this point started this race way down in P18, so this will be a real strong finish for Gasly versus Ocon to round out the season. He'll make a lovely move round the outside of the Alfa Romeo as you've got the Red Bull of Perez having a go at George Russell up ahead, and Gasly's going to look to try and get a run and stick with them. And by the end of that lap, Sainz actually has damage and comes in for a pit stop. So Gasly is up into P7, and the Frenchman is hungry for more, as on lap 2 he senses maybe there might be an opportunity to get stuck in with this battle that's been going on since the very first lap of Russell versus Sergio Perez, Red Bull versus Mercedes. He's going to stick behind. The two of them ahead of him are still going at it. Behind, you've got a nice move for Mick Schumacher versus Gasly's old teammate Yuki Tsunoda. Ocon really hasn't made much progress at this stage. He's still down there in P17, and then Gasly is going to make it 3 wide and go for the double overtake on the Mercedes and Red Bull. Get the elbows out on the soft compounder tyre, makes a exquisite move to get ahead of the Silver Arrow and the Red Bull, and gets up into P5. Now, I will admit, because it's a 5-lap race and he's chosen softs, and for whatever reason the other AI, some of them have chosen the medium compounder tyre, that will be a factor. Whether it would have been different playing out in a simulation of a 100% race, potentially, but I wanted to bring you a full, you know, replay view of the final lap of his season in Alpine, and he is going to finish up in P5. So an amazing and stonking effort to get, I think, his best race result of the entire season in the final race in Yas Marina. So Gasly will finish the season with more points than Esteban Ocon. The biggest takeaway, though, for me, is if you really look at it, is that the two of them were so strong as a pairing that they just got so many more points than they probably should have if you look at where Alpine were in the R&D chart. And I truly believe that will actually translate into real life in 2023. I think they're going to be such a strong pairing, as long as, you know, no fireworks happen between between the two former friends, then enemies, and then maybe just respectable drivers and teammates now. As long as fireworks don't, you know, pop up, I think they're both going to be such strong, solid, reliable assets for Alpine. Reliable being the word as well for the team itself. They need to sort out reliability. But so overall, this video may have not given us a good picture of Alpine versus McLaren because the game just skewed McLaren to upgrade so quickly versus them. But I think it gave us a good insight into how closely matched and a solid pairing the French and French connection is going to be for this French team. So guys, if you have enjoyed the video, hit the like button. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Let me know what scenario you want me to do next with this kind of video in the future. If you're new around here, do get subscribed for weekly Formula 1 content. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.